are now recording.
And Karen, I did hear you talk about vaccines.
Yes.
So I did want everyone to know that April is the date when it's opening up for everyone 16 and older. And I was able to get my first dose, and they're not turning people away. So if you can get signed up, they're just taking you in. We went to Allen Park in a mayor sitting in front of a pile of logs, and that was just great. So it was good old public health as it should be.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so vaccinate yourselves so we can go back to something that looks like normal in the fall.
What organization was that you were able to just walk in and get it?
I wasn't able to walk in. We had to make an appointment, but it was the mayor. I'm still Meyer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, also people in Oakland County and Macomb County can also use the Ford Field. And they're going to have extraordinary capacity, so that'll be good. Okay, so this is the annual AAUP tenure workshop. Welcome all of you. Getting tenure is horrible. Having tenure is wonderful. So what we're going to try to do is create an environment where you can be successful, and that it will certainly be tense, because it's a big deal. So it is tense, but we're going to try to make it a doable objective that can be broken down into small steps, and so that you're fine. So a couple of logistic things, which I'm seeing is already good. Basically, our protocol is normally when you're not speaking, have your mic off. Sometimes people want to ask a question, but they're a little concerned about asking it in this sort of vaguely public forum. So if you have a question that you wish were confidential, that you don't want people to know that you're the one asking it, please private message, through the comments, the chat section on this, Amy Pollard, and then she will read the question without any personal attributes. So that way you're not going to be recorded in any way. So, you can feel a little bit more comfortable asking those questions. Also, certainly in the long run, if you have questions about the tenure process, please feel free to consult with the AAUP. I'm reasonably certain that if you contacted the folks on the panel today, they would also be happy to answer your questions. But the senior faculty are here to try to help you in this whole process. So keep that in mind as you go through. Now, today, what we're going to be doing is we have 3 presenters, which is sort of normal from the faculty. These are folks who have served on various review committees, both in their units, but also at the university level. And they are Derek Hastings, Yang Fu, and Debtaj Debnath. So they will be giving a little sort of 5-minute piece of advice for everyone in just a few moments. Also, the new provost, Britt Rios Ellis, is with us today, and she will also be commenting on sort of her position in this process, and basically giving sort of general advice about how she sees this process. But first, we're going to begin with Kathy Battles. I just want to explain that since the pandemic, we have been coordinating with the university and trying to come up with a set of principles in terms of how we respond to the particular circumstances of the pandemic, what happens over things like childcare and so on and so forth. And so the current sort of phase of that set of negotiations is going on. There are 3 representatives from the faculty and 3 representatives from the university, and they're talking about sort of the next step forward. And Kathy Battles is on that committee. She is a member of the Department of Communication, Journalism, and Public Relations, and has been around for a while and kind of knows the ropes. So I'm going to ask Kathy just to sort of explain about what is going on with that committee and where she sees it going in the near future and how it might affect all you.
Thanks, Karen, for making me sound really old. Um, so I'm on this committee, and it grew out of the work of the AAUP advisory committee, which gave a statement about the impact of COVID for people in the tenure and promotion process. And we handed out a statement about the different kinds of impacts that could happen to faculty members, and we advised faculty members to start recording all of the impacts that they have experienced because of COVID. And one of the things that we're working on with the university is developing really two sets of statements that we hope will be developed. One statement will be for departments. We're currently working at having departments prepare statements that would basically be attached to tenure and promotion documents. They're not about the criteria, but they are about providing context for how different departments in different disciplines have borne the impacts of COVID in terms of the kind of research that faculty members do and in terms of the kind of teaching that faculty members do, because those impacts are differential across campus. But here today, what I can say to you, the most important thing to do, and what everyone is beginning to realize, is that COVID is going to have a multi-year impact on people's careers. And that is a growing awareness of the union, and that's a growing awareness at the university level, that this is a kind of event that is not just 1 year of disruption, but it's going to mean multiple years of disruption for faculty members. So there's an awareness that it's going to keep affecting you throughout your review process. So the most important thing I can say to you today is to just start recording any kind of disruption you feel like that you have experienced, and to record it as it happens so that you don't forget about it, and to record, you know, adjustments you've had to make to your teaching, adjustments that you've had to make in your home life in terms of childcare or technology or parent care or family care or your own health care and your own needs, adjustments that you've had to make to your research, disruptions in access to resources in labs, etc., in access to things like archives, and in terms of the lack of performance possibilities for people who are engaged in the fine arts and exhibition possibilities. So to just keep making those kinds of notes to yourself, because we are going to be asking faculty members to submit documents with their materials about the impact of COVID on their careers, and to keep in mind that you're going to want to keep making these statements throughout the review process, to think about how the impacts might have ripple effects for you throughout the next, you know, wherever you are in the review process, but you know, the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years as you move through the process. And I think that's the best I can say right now. So again, to sum up my not very eloquent statement, we are working to have departments support faculty with statements that do talk about disciplinary specific impacts and department specific impacts on faculty, but we are also asking faculty to make sure that they start recording impacts that they have experienced as a result of COVID. So I don't know if anybody needs anything more. I mean, people always need more, but.
Actually, Kathy, I'm going to ask you a question because this has come up. Has the committee talked about the fact that some faculty might be uncomfortable documenting some of the personal things? That's come up in a couple of different units, and I wondered if you guys had talked about how to handle that.
I don't think we have talked about that yet, but I think that's a great question for me to bring back. And I do want to say that at this point, everything is still in process, and that everything will be brought back to the union, and that I think we're going to bring the department statement to department chairs to go over. So I think that this isn't going to be a statement that's just made by this committee, but this is a process where the committee will bring things back to the union and bring things to department chairs so that those kind of questions can be addressed. I certainly understand that people might be reluctant to give out information. And my sense is that these statements should be fairly general. um, that, you know, it's not, and they're really for the review committees, that these statements are for review, are they, and in general, like one of the things you'll learn today is that when you prepare your materials, and all the presenters today are great, and I think they'll do a great job helping you do that. But when you present your materials, you want to present the context for your case for tenure and promotion, and that these materials are part of that context. So they're not really, they're really for those review committees just to understand what you might have experienced. And like I said, a lot of the work of that can even happen at the department level statement, which will provide context and support for you so that maybe you don't have to feel as much that you have to. I mean, I'm saying document everything. I'm not saying you should spit everything out um, in your statement, but just that you will have that with you when you go to prepare statements, et cetera, and as you think about the case that you are making. So what is the name of your committee? Oh, somebody's asking about the name of my committee. I have no
Don't
idea
have
what
a
the name of our
name, do
committee
you?
is.
We call it different things. It's the joint.
I don't think we
Committee.
have it. Oh, we call it right now. It's just the joint committee. That's all it's called. And I have like, is it about joints or I have no idea what the name of our committee is. And and really, so joint committee is good. And so far we've been meeting every other week. And I think we've made some pretty remarkable progress. Um, so um, so I think we're moving along, and I think the most important thing to realize about the committee is that both the AAUP and the university realize that the effect of this is meaningful, and is significant, and that it is not a one-off, one-year kind of disruption in people's careers, but that we're looking at, like I said, a ripple effect set of disruptions that will have consequences going down the line. And so far, everyone seems on board with realizing that and understanding that. And I think that's a good thing. I don't know what that, like I said, it's still all in process.
So if I may intervene, Kathy has to bounce because she's
I
also
do.
you have to do go for the gold today.
Yep.
So thank you so much for coming and have a wonderful time at Go for the Gold. And
Thanks. And anyone can email me with questions. I'm happy to answer questions via email, and I can throw that in the chat. And I'm also happy to answer any questions people have about promotion. I'm sure after today, you'll all be like, wow, she knows what's going on, or not. So don't even know they're in my own committee. So anyways, have a great morning, everyone.
thank you, Kathy. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, for those of you who are at the early stages of the process, at some point you will be asked to do Go for the Gold. Be ready for it. It's fun. A little unusual, but fun. What we're going to do next is the next three presenters are going to give you all what they think is the most important piece of advice that you can have as you approach this whole process. And so let's just actually begin with Derek Hastings. So Derek, can you go first?
Yes, I can. My first piece of advice would be to use events like this to get out of Go for the Gold, which is what I did today. So that is the first. Go for the Gold is fun, but not that fun, if we're honest. So yeah, I'm Derek Hastings. I'm from the history department. I'm in my third year on FRPC this year. I chaired FRPC last year. And so I know in these sorts of events, it's very unlikely that I or my fellow presenters will say anything that's genuinely new. I think the goal is mainly to, I don't know, reinforce some of the material that's already out there. And at least from my perspective, point out a couple of, not pitfalls, but a couple of things to keep in mind from the perspective of FRPC, which of course is the review body that comes after the departmental level and then the various CAP levels. And so it's sort of dealing with all of the cases from all of the schools across the university. And I guess the most important thing for me is you will have already done the heavy lifting. right, and building your case over several years by the time you come up. And so really try to make sure you get it across the finish line by being detail oriented. And I think that's one of the things that can help a body like FRPC the most, and can help you feel the least amount of stress as a candidate. And some of the things that I think it's useful to keep in mind, we always say, make sure you know your unit's criteria. And I think most people going up for tenure really do pay attention to that. That is obviously important. But there are some units that have very specific criteria that sometimes the cases that come to us, it doesn't seem that the candidates necessarily dug down into the specifics that we're sort of forced to use as our matrix when we kind of look through the cases. And so if your unit has very specific criteria about internal or external funding, or if your unit has very specific criteria in regard to teaching, let's say, for new course development or for curriculum development or these sorts of things, make sure it's clear in your material that you've pitched your tenure case in line with those specificities, because that's kind of what we're forced to look at, and is that level of detail. The second thing I would point out, one of the things that I wish candidates would keep in mind, and also their review committees would keep in mind, is that FRPC has a set of guidelines that lay out what external reviewers should look like. And I think, I mean, it says basically what you would expect, but if you have people who are former classmates, former colleagues, research collaborators, co-authors, or co-mentors, those should not be used as external evaluators. And if there's any question, I forget exactly how we phrase it, but if there's any question about whether somebody falls into one of those categories, then don't use that person as an external reviewer. And this can be challenging in certain fields. Obviously, if you're in a field where there are a very limited number of people who really know your material or are in a position to evaluate it, then it can get a little bit challenging, right? To try to figure out, well, you know, I've been on a panel with this person, but I haven't been a co-author, so I can use them. Or I've had this sort, you know, that we both knew my doctoral advisor, but I was a student of my doctoral advisor and this person wasn't, or whatever. There are ways to try to make sure that you don't fall afoul of those guidelines. But I think that's really important because, again, a review body like FRPC has to rely on the independent external reviewers in order to make our way through, particularly the scholarship. And that's something that I do kind of want to emphasize that tends to get overlooked at times. And we've had cases where people have had, we've had cases where people have had former collaborators and co-authors and these sorts of things. So what I would suggest is those perspectives can be very useful, but you would probably want to have those letters included as simply letters of support, which can supplement your official external review letters, but not serve as a replacement for those letters. In fact, if you've had a postdoc with somebody, or you've had some sort of a working relationship and somebody really can speak to the quality of your scholarship, those can be included in a way that doesn't violate the external review guidelines. So that would be something to keep in mind. And I think I've talked long enough. The last thing I'll say is just make sure that your materials are as easy to locate as possible. And I think that, you know, we're willing to and have sort of dug around and tried to look as you know, in every nook and cranny to figure out, well, where is this document? It's supposed to be in the e-dossier, and it seems to be very difficult to find. Usually we're pretty good at deciphering those, but the more straightforward and clear you can make the process, the easier it makes it for a review body like FRPC, which really, my participation, I think, here today is only valuable insofar as I've been on FRPC. So that's basically what I'm using as my my criteria, I guess, for having anything to say about this process. So I'd be happy as a former chair of FRPC. I know the other two, Liang and Devtosh, have been on FRPC with me, and they have a tremendous amount of insight as well, but I'd be happy to answer any other questions in more detail a little bit later. But I'll pass it on to, should we go to Liang next? Okay.
Okay, thanks, Derek, and thank you, Karen, for inviting me for this event. I'm from Department of Accounting and Finance. I served on on FRPC from 2017 to 2020. And I think Derek has highlighted some of the very important issues faced by FRPC, and I don't really want to repeat those things. I mean, it sounds very basic that we need to follow the process, but it really means a lot to follow the process. The closer you follow the process, the better you're presenting your cases to various review committees. And I would like to really share some of the things that, based on my own experience. So I joined OU in 2009. And hindsight, I wish that there were a few things that I have done better to prepare for my tenure case. I think the first thing is the tenure process is a long process. It's easily 6 years. And you really need to have a roadmap for the next 6 years in mind. Things you've done for the first year or second year can potentially affect year 6 review, the final review. And along the way, we have 2-year review, 4-year review, or some of the units have different schedules. Keep those things in mind because those are like checkpoints that you really need to pass to be able to move forward. And along the way, make sure that you document everything. It doesn't matter how small you think that award is, it is still an award. There were a ton of moments where I was sitting on FRPC meetings and I was like, you know what, I did not include that in my dossier because I didn't think it would matter, right? But things really matter. There is no things that will be considered as too small to be worthy documenting. So definitely make sure you document everything along those 6-year process. And I think the last piece of advice I would like to share is that we need to be very proactive. Not every unit has some kind of formal or informal mentor to guide you through the process. I was extremely fortunate that I've had a lot of informal mentorship during my tenure process. My chair was great. He was really on top of things to make sure that I check every single box for our unit's criterion. And there were a few senior faculty members who really guided me through the process. If your unit does not really have anything like that, it does not really prevent you from seeking help from all the senior faculty members because they're there to help you to, first of all, understand the language of the criteria. It can be very confusing. Exactly what do we mean by saying this? You need to clear the confusion earlier in your stage. And they're there to guide you through what kind of documents you need to prepare and how you should plan for that 6-year process to be successful at the very end. So definitely reach out to them and do not think that, well, since we do not have a mentorship program, they're not going to give you the help. They're there to make sure that you can be successful by the end of your 6th year. So these are really the things that, based on my own experience, that I would like to share with the group. Thank you.
Thank you. So why don't we go to Devatosh and you can sort of add your perspective on this.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and good morning, everyone. I am from School of Engineering and Computer Science, as Karen earlier mentioned. I have served in our school's CAP, I believe 6 years or 7 years, and this is my 3rd or 4th year in FRPC, I think 3rd year. And I had the honor to work with both Derek and Liang. So they are certainly, I learned also different things from them. So they already talked, so I do not know what I am going to add to that. But let me say this, that when I received the email from Karen, that she mentioned the best thing you can do for a successful review. Can you give some idea? So best thing you can do is you have 4 friends and check with these 4 friends. I'm going to talk about, and already my colleagues already mentioned those 4 friends. Your first friend is your FRPC general statement. Every year, FRPC publishes a 4-5 pages document. usually stay the same from year to year. There are some minor variations. So first, please read those FRPC general statements. If you are going for tenure review in 2 years, you can check it now, or in 5 years, check it now, or next year, check it now. It's probably not going to significantly change. FRPC, when does the review, they actually look to the FRPC general statement and how the dossier, how the criteria, how the department has followed the FRPC general guidelines. So it's very important that you look to that document very carefully. Then the second best friend is your unit's criteria, whether it's college or whether it's school. Every unit has their published criteria. It is very important. Already my colleagues mentioned that you read that, and also please make sure there is nothing you actually forget to address or consider this is not important. As Derek already mentioned, that if your department say there has to be this, then please make sure you have ability to check that box, plan accordingly. Then your third best friend is your advisory committee. Advisory committee in your department or in your school. The members of your advisory committee, please communicate with them so that they are aware of your work, and also you can in timely manner provide them any updated information and stay involved. So if you do not stay involved with your advisory committee, different advisory committee has different way to work. Some advisory committee will be pretty much doing everything 100% of them themselves. Some advisory committee make the department secretary involved. Some advisory committee will make the even candidate involved in some of the aspects. So please stay in touch with the advisory committee and ask them if they need anything from you, if you can help in any way in the review process. And also seek advice from the advisory committee that if you can do anything to improve your CV, let's say, or present your case in a better way. That is your third best friend. Your fourth best friend going to be your colleagues and your chairperson. Please find someone in the department, if possible, or in your school or in the campus, who can advise you on this review process so that you do not miss any pieces of information that you should do. So that, and your chairperson probably is very aware of all the facets of this process. So please have some informal chat with him or her, and or sometime, not just before the review, but on an ongoing basis, so that you receive appropriate feedback and prepare for that. Also, we should understand that our tenure and promotion criteria, it's some of these documents are decades, evolved over decades. So these documents, some of these documents are 30, 40 years ago started and have gone through many iterations. So the every word has been added to those documents have a meaning. So please make sure that you pay attention. I'm repeating the same thing. And also, it is my understanding, different departments, different academic units handles or prepares dossier in different way. So my recommendation would be that you please take the ownership of dossier as much as your department, your unit allows. Please do not delegate. So let's say your department allows you to assemble the final dossier and upload, or your department secretary is allowed to upload. You please take the ownership and you do it so that you know that everything has been presented in such a manner that conforms the FRPC guidelines or your unit's guidelines. This is very important. So please take the ownership of your dossier so that it is done absolutely following the procedure. Also, my colleagues already mentioned that curriculum vitae and backup materials. Here I have 4 things I'm going to say. That are there any ambiguity in the CV? So let's say I am from engineering, I am reading a CV from another discipline. Would I be able to understand it? So that is very important. Are there conflicting information in the CV and backup materials? Because as FRPC member, I will try to link the backup material and the CV. Would I be able to do, or one going to conflict with others? So please see that if you can help in that process so that the reviewers have a much more easy time to review them. And also the backup materials and CV not only conflict, are they support each other, reinforce one thing by other. So I think that's kind of my best friend talk. So thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone. And I am also very glad to see that our Provost Rias Ellis actually have joined this Saturday morning event. I truly appreciate her this openness to attend this meeting and work with our faculty colleagues. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Devatash.
Well, thank you all, faculty presenters. And so I think in terms of the presentation part of today, we're going to turn to our new provost to have the opportunity to say a few things about how she views the process and how she hopes to facilitate your success.
So as I was reading over, the hundreds of tips you see, I think that you've all touched on so many things, and I'm going to tell you something that I think is very, very important, and that is keep your sense of humor and cultural humility at all times, because I think it can be overwhelming, and it can be, oh my gosh, I don't have that one thing documented, or oh, I lost this, or oh. And I will tell you that I had to go through your process, right? And I had to go through your process after my house burned down. So I had lost almost all of my materials. And one of the things that was so important, thankfully, the publications are still there. I didn't have time to get the grant documents from the Freedom of Information, all of the things that but I would very, very much rely, and I did rely on my CV, because all of the numbers for the grant mechanisms were on my CV. All of the publications were on my CV, everything. So when I first heard that I had to go back up, I panicked for just a little bit. And then I kept my sense of humor and my sense of cultural humility. And I went, okay, you've got this, right? You've got all of this. And I think that's so important. So don't let anything rock your sense of where you are and what you've achieved already. One of the things that helped me, and I'm going to date myself, right? I'm 58. I'll just say it out there. So one of the things that I think is so important is to keep a file. And someone told me that. And I think you've all spoken to the organization. And what I did was I kept a file every year. So anyone sent me a thank you letter because I'd done a presentation, or sent me a letter around one of my publications, or anything like that, I just kept filing things for every single year. And that was really, really helpful, because when I needed to go back, and now of course you can do digital files and actual files, right? At that time, we were turning in what we called sarcophagi, right? Very large crates of information. And, you know, and they were big. I mean, it took several people to carry that. Now it's so wonderful because they're all digital, right? And I would say that's the other thing that I would say, having gone through what I just went through, is if you can use digital format, use it, right? Don't opt for the paper trail, and really start to chart, this is your history. And I don't think there's any, well, there are very few other professions where you can really track your history. You know, how you've contributed to the institution, how you've contributed to your discipline, how you've contributed to, you know, to the meaning behind your science, right? And your teaching methods, all of that. So really document that as you go through. And I think that, you know, learn who's helpful and who isn't helpful, right? You will have colleagues who are very genuinely helpful. And then you will have colleagues who scare you every time you talk to them. And you need to weigh when that will be, who you need to talk to in that moment, right? So I think really targeting where you are in terms of, you want to be responsive to the RTP process, right? You really want to be responsive to it, or not RTP, FRPC, right? Am I right? Good. Okay. You want to be really responsive to this. You don't, and you want to be reflective. You don't want to be reactive to it, right? Because when you start to react to what's going on, you lose that ability to reflect and respond thoughtfully. So, you know, if you find yourself in a moment where you're starting to get, you know, maybe a little too into your head, or wherever that place is where you're starting to feel like you're reactive, pull yourself back a little bit, get some mind space around it, and then go back to it. And I think that, you know, one of the things that someone told me, there's no way around, right? There's only through. So the sooner you start to go through the process, and the sooner you start to chart everything, it's very important. And I also would echo, and I know Derek said this, I think all of you said this, organize your stuff very, very well. The last thing you want a reviewer to do is to have to go through every single thing and look for that one appendix. And now, you know, again, now they're all digital. We can do word searches. In my time, I probably sound like your grandmother saying they walked 2 miles through the snow, but you know, we couldn't. It had to be really careful indexes, very careful table of contents, everything very, very well designed. But I think what made it easier for me was one of the review committee members said right after, before I even got my letter, came up and congratulated me, saying, "This was the best organized dossier we've ever had. Thank you so much. You made our job easy." And I could kind of relax a little bit, right? So organization is really key. So when you're writing your statements, think about parenthetically, even if you can't find the evidence right now, don't get stuck in finding that evidence, but write a little, you know, whatever it is, however you do it, you know, question mark, or add evidence, and you highlight that in red, and that'll start to tell you where you need to go back to find that missing thank you letter, or the letter of acceptance for the journal article that you know, that will be published very soon, but isn't out yet. The other thing that I think is really, really important on grant and any grant awards is to memorize, not memorize, they're too long to memorize, but document that number, right? What is that grant mechanism number, so that you've got that right there. So just in case someone wants to trace it, they can. You know, if you have electronic, well, everything's electronic now, but really just being able to associate, so that the review committee members have it very, very easy when they're going through your file. You want them to think about your narrative, not to get stuck in, where is that evidence, right? And that to me was really key. You know, and I think just giving yourself a little bit of time, and this is always easier said than done. And maybe this can be the advantage of COVID, is just a little bit more reflective time, because we can't do all the things that we used to be able to do, just to get organized. And again, when you find yourself getting reactive to it, pull yourself away for a little bit, find that mind space you need to go back and be responsively reflective. I'm trying to think of what else. And I think the other thing that's so important is there are no stupid questions in this, right? This is your career. This is your life story. Our jobs aren't normal jobs where we're 8 to 5 and we go home. We carry this with us. This is, for me, it's being a professor was so exciting because you get to be part of creating science, and you get to be part of, the same time you're disseminating knowledge, you're creating knowledge. What an amazing space to be in. So I think, keep that in mind, and just organize as much as you can, and just ask questions. If one of your colleagues ever treats you as if you've asked a stupid question, ask the same question to someone else, right? I guarantee you, and I also think as a junior professor, there were so many times that I had the same questions that my colleagues had, but no one was asking those questions. And I just started asking them, right? And that helps, Devatosh talked about these documents, each word has a meaning. If we're doing our jobs well, each word will have a meaning. And they've been, I don't want to say perfected because nothing's ever perfect, right? Perfect is the enemy of good, but they have been made better periodically over time. So if there's something that isn't clear, that's a good sign to your department that, hey, maybe we need to explain this a little bit more concisely or clearly or both. So, those are the things that I guess I would take away, my tidbits of advice. So I hope that was helpful.
I think it was. I would like to begin by thanking all the presenters today, because I think this was exactly the kind of advice that untenured faculty need to hear. And also, I know there are a few people who already have tenure and may be going up for full. And this is something that we also always need to remind ourselves as we start moving up to the next phase of the process, because yes, all of you assistant professors and special instructors out there, there are other steps after you are okay.
Karen, I would like to say one thing about that. I think that's really important, because once we get to associate, moving through to full, right? Don't let your momentum get lost in all of that, right? And I've been noticing as I'm going through files, we have a lot of folks who are associate and need to move through to full. So that's one of the things academic affairs is going to be helping with, is really seeing where and how folks are getting a little stuck in the process and helping folks realize that full professor, if that's something they want. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but
that's okay.
Thank you for saying.
No, I'm glad, because actually I was going to announce at the end that actually we in the AAUP are also looking at the idea of having something like this, but for people who are associates, and looking at that transition into full. And because there is this career transformation that you make once you get tenure. And so how do you continue to capitalize on that process? So, but what we would like to do for our remaining time is respond to any questions that have been posed. Amy, do you have any questions?
I have a bunch.
Okay.
I'm going to sound like I'm really invested in the tenure process that I've never been a part of, but just go with it. All right. So first question is, FRPC is using diversity advocates now. And the question is, what is being done, or is anything being done about using diversity advocates at the other levels of reviews? Because it seems slightly problematic that one review body is being really deliberate and about this, and others maybe are not as much. So.
Can I speak, Karen?
Why not?
Okay, so we instituted, so I can only speak to the FRPC thing. And I think the thinking, we instituted a diversity and equity advocate position last year when I was chair, partly because there was a concern over sort of the way that deliberations are carried out. So there's one level of like when you need to keep diversity and equity in mind when you're formulating review statements, right? when you're deliberating over it, I think it's very important to kind of keep the focus strictly on the statements themselves and to try to remove all the gray areas. Gray areas are potential for bias, whether unconscious or conscious to emerge. And so I don't think we've done much, honestly, to address diversity on FRPC so much as to have an equity advocate, which we kind of call a diversity and equity advocate, but a person whose job is to be extra familiar with the criteria of the unit whose candidate is under review during that discussion, and to keep the discussion on track if there's any sort of deviance or deviation into talking about gray areas. A potential pitfall here is student evaluations, perceptions of how, there are, women, and particularly women of color, are clearly disadvantaged in student evaluations. And in discussing sort of what an evaluation comment means, it's very easy for a discussion to stray into something that doesn't specifically stay focused on the criteria and potentially could be damaging to the candidate. And so the diversity issue, I think, was a little bit less, it's a little bit tougher to kind of work in than the equity part, which was basically to make sure that the process is equitable, to be as kind of simplistic about it as possible. And so my hope would be, Karen, I don't know if the union is involved in this, it would be that, the CAPs, or I know the School of Nursing, yeah, they have an NCAP. They don't have the department level, but at the various levels of review, where the department, CAP, and then FRPC, if we could kind of be intentional about keeping those sorts of things in mind. And I was going to offer, I think myself or Dominique, who's the current chair of FRPC, would be happy to talk to individual CAP people about how the process went on FRPC if it does come to then trying to implement these sorts of things at different levels. But that's something I can add.
And I can speak to it a little bit because we've had this conversation. The DEI Senate Committee has been working on this, and actually one of the two fellows, whose name I'm not going to remember right now. Jason Wasserman, right. And so that's one thing that they've been looking at. And one of the things that they've sort of talked about is encouraging departments, individual departments, to avail themselves of this equity training. And actually, I don't know if it was you and I, Karen, or maybe it was Beth and I don't know, one meeting with the provost when it was Michelle, when she was sitting in still. We had the conversation about whether the provost office has that same sort of, are they using that same equity lens that Derek just spoke about? And Michelle's response at the time was that, I think she felt that training had been done at that level. So the DEI Senate Committee, I think, is engaged in making attempts in this level.
So one of the things that I think we are going to start doing is implicit bias training for all search committees. We're in the process of doing that, and maybe it would be a great idea to do this for FRPC as well. I'm not sure. So if folks think that, because that way, when statements are made, people know that it's their role to bystander in and to counter things that are factually erroneous and attributed to one candidate or the other, right? Or one faculty member or the other. And it puts not to make it a gotcha, right? Everyone makes mistakes. And again, perfect is the enemy of good. But we want to make sure that the lenses that we're viewing different candidates for, whether it's tenure and promotion or a position, are as equitable as possible. So, that might be something that Karen and Amy, can you remind me? And then we'll move in our meetings, we can move forward and seeing whether that would be something that would be useful.
Yeah, and I think it's not just important at the FRPC level, but I think at the departmental and the CAP level
absolutely
is where part of that conversation is. So,
and if can I add something also about that? So we did the unconscious bias training last year with Jason, with Cynthia, who was a fellow last year, Cynthia Myrie. But it needs to happen every year. And so I'm glad that the provost brought that up, because of course we have a kind of rotating membership on FRPC. And so the more that we can kind of codify and institutionalize these sorts of things, the more we can make sure stuff doesn't fall through the cracks, or that things don't seep back in. We think, well, we had unconscious bias training one time 10 years ago, we're good, right? It's like we got vaccinated, but it doesn't work that way, obviously. So that's a great point.
Yeah, and I would say, certainly the AAUP is supportive of this as an institution, but also I think, when it started at FRPC, that made the most sense as a point of origin, simply because FRPC is the one organization that reads all of the dossiers for these major decisions. And I was always under the impression that the goal was to eventually have similar, if not identical, training as we move down through the colleges. And that way it would make the work of FRPC easier if we had, a kind of more robust, more uniform understanding of the potential pitfalls at all of the levels, at the department, at the CAPS, at the FRPC. So.
Can I also add a few things about DEI? Our university has offered the DEI trainings for the faculty members. You can just voluntarily enroll in the training program. And I also know that on the unit level, at least for our school, we've just formed the DEI committee, and we're about to send surveys to the faculty members as a first round to bring the awareness of DEI. And I went through the DEI training, and it was very eye-opening. So I would encourage the faculty members to get involved into the topic as well.
Yes, I will also echo the same sentiment that I have also gone through the training through Shuttle, and when they organized, and Cynthia was presenter, and it was eye-opener. It was very informative. So I think we should make such training widely available in campus. I think that will help all of us.
I don't want to belabor this point, but Karen, just one more thing in case I forget. First off, I think we started with FRPC because last year or 2 years ago, we realized we had like 5 of us who were on FRPC and on the DEI committee. Devitush, you were there, and myself. Yeah. So that was an easy liaison. One of the things I thought about is the possibility at the beginning of each academic year is to maybe have a kind of mini retreat. We don't have to call it that for people on FRPC and the individual CAPs, so that we can kind of together think through some of these issues in a way that's more seamless than if it was done in a sort of broken up thing. And I don't know what role, if any, the AAUP could play in sort of trying to help, orchestrate something like that. Obviously the provost office as well, but I think that that would be really helpful to see for people on CAP also to see the sorts of questions that FRPC members have and the perspective that they bring and vice versa. And that might be an easier way of maximizing resources too.
I think the union would be we would be a good place to organize all those bodies, I think, in one place. So yeah. Karen, I'm going to ask another question now. All right. So question about how you bring in and document your work from previous institutions. So if you come in from a previous institution, you're granted a certain amount of time, your dossier is going to look different than someone else who's been at OU's a certain amount of time. So do people have advice about how to handle that?
So a lot of that would be reflected in your CV, right? What you've taught, your publications, any grant activity you've done, any service activity you've done, any committees you've sat on, any consulting you've done, those kinds of things would be reflected. I think and again, if you've gone through a process somewhere else, hopefully that's in either your file or your electronic dossier. I think that, also your teaching evaluations, making it very clear that the institution where you come from evaluates teaching this way, right? Within the CSU, there's an 8-point Likert scale, and the overall effectiveness is number 8, and that's what everyone looks at. So getting that information, I really recommend for folks, and I want to be clear, I don't know if I know how it's done here, but making sure that those, mean, standard deviations, all of those things are put into a table, and that table just gets added to, right, as you go along. So you can really show, and you already have that. So if there's a different way of measuring, it's just 2 tables instead of 1, right? So I think a lot of those things should be reflected. And I you know, I can't say I do it every year, but almost every year I update my CV.
Other feedback on that question? Panel? Are we good?
I think in those circumstances, let's say someone is here after 2 years or 3 years serving in another institution and come here as assistant professor and want to go for tenure in 2 years. In that case, certainly the person who has experience like that, FRPC will absolutely look to the shorter period the person is, how productive and how the student perception of teaching, and is it comparable to another person 2 years here. And certainly the previous teaching, research, everything will be looked at. However, FRPC will give a significant focus on the period here the person is, and is it comparable productivity? So certainly that way also will be looked at. Certainly not, certainly the prior experience or prior teaching or prior research will not be ignored. However, what Oakland University the person accomplished, that will demonstrate the person's continued productivity in that domain. So it's a mix of both, I believe.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question. Do folks have advice on whether or not people should put unaccepted grant proposals on in their dossiers as research? That they've been sort of encouraged by some faculty to do it because there's so much work that goes into creating grant proposals. Other faculty have said not to do it because it doesn't look good because they weren't accepted. So advice?
Absolutely. I would put it in. It shows that you're working toward a track record. And you can also, I mean, there have been several times where I've submitted a grant. It's been qualified as fundable, but the line was just above it, right? Or below it, depending on how the score goes, right? So showing, and I think also showing the resilience around resubmission, right? We took this and we resubmitted, just like you would with an article, right? And if you have a revised resubmit, you know, on an article or on a grant, I mean, I always do it with a table. You know, these were the 8 points that the reviewers wanted. This is where they were in the paper, and this is how they were addressed. And I always do that on all of my revised resubmit. And I don't think we've ever had a revised resubmit turned down. You know, because you're addressing each point of that review. So, you know, the same thing with a grant. I really, and if it's currently under review, you can show the reviewer who's looking at your dossier what you did to improve your score. And particularly if you're going for NSF or NIH or some of those, getting a score is an accomplishment. Right. So I was just working with a junior faculty member in my former institution who went for a K award. And, you know, she kept, I'm going to get it. And I said, you know, her name was Lisa. It's fantastic if you get it, but I'm going to be really happy if you just get a score. She got a fundable score. It wasn't funded the first time. She worked to resubmit it, funded. And so you want to see that trajectory. Those, you know, R1s, R21s, R15s, those aren't easy things to do at all. So, you know, showing that trajectory and showing that resilience is really important.
Derek, did you have something to add there?
She said it way better than I would have said it. So yeah, it's very helpful. It comes up in FRPC that we would like to see the scoring, and the persistence is actually, I've never heard it mentioned in a negative way in an FRPC discussion, as far as the kind of stick-to-itiveness of the process, because so much work goes into it. So I would say, I mean, I guess there could be cases that haven't come up where maybe there's a detriment, but I think in every case, include that material. So much work went into it. It really does help us in our deliberation.
Would you all give the same advice about grants in other fields, like in the humanities, for unsuccessful humanities grants? Would you give the same sort of advice to include it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I will also do. Because to write a grant proposal, it sometimes takes much more effort than writing an article in many instances.
Mhm.
So if someone has submitted 10 times, that actually shows as proposed to mention, the resiliency of the work of the person. So I will absolutely, irrespective of the discipline, please include your all the list, all the submitted proposals in the CV. And if there are a score, please put that in the CV also. And add all those information in backup materials. It's absolutely important, I think.
Thank you very much.
Amy, I would say to that, I have seen cases where people turned in almost exactly the same thing, right? So show how you followed the recommendations of the reviewers. That is really essential. So it's not just, well, I turned it in again, right? And I would say to faculty members, it's, you know, on a lot of our work with URM, first gen educated folks, students, faculty, I never want to get stuck in the resiliency part. Oh, you're so resilient, right? Wow, just keep going. Because there's also self-efficacy that's being gained there, right? So it's not just resiliency, it's self-efficacy. And that potentiates so much more, right? And really helping folks recognize what they're gaining, even when things are being turned down, right? And I would say, you know, no amount is too small or too large, right? That you know, whether it's a small grant or a larger grant, right? I mean, you know, and if it's a federal grant, we know there's 7 bills that run the government, right? And you can kind of figure it out depending on which party is in power, which bills are going to be generative in terms of funding. So, you know, there's political strategy to this as well. So I think it's, you know, what's the bipartisan bill that no one's going to mess with at any time, right? Maybe I need to go that direction at a time. So, you know, there's just, I think, you know, what folks want to see is that people are running the long race.
Okay, good. Another question, do members have any advice on how to build up your external review network? If, you know, that sort of Derek talked about how that can be kind of difficult in some fields. How does a junior faculty, do you have advice on how to go about doing that? Derek, looks like he's trying to unmute.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that it's so discipline specific that it really depends on how big the pond that your officiant is. And I think it also depends, your strategy will depend on whether it is exclusively your review committee that picks the external reviewers without your input as a candidate. I mean, most candidates have at least some kind of informal veto power. If somebody, you know, there was a personal, you know, some sort of altercation, please don't ask this person or whatever. But so it depends on that. But I think generally, the people, you want to mix together an amount of familiarity, but it doesn't necessarily have to be such an overlap with your own work that the person is one of only 5 people or so who would know about this. I mean, try as much as possible if you have a sort of collaborative role in the selection process, even if you as the candidate, you are not saying ask these people if the review committee does it, but at least give the review committee a big enough pool that isn't necessarily only on your sort of narrow field, and try to think about the bigger fish in your pond, even if you don't know them that well. I think from our perspective as FRPC reviewers, it matters a lot if we have an impartial external evaluation from a clear heavy hitter, because oftentimes those people are quite generous in their comments towards junior faculty as well. And I think when you're thinking as a candidate, oftentimes you're thinking, well, I just want to get the person who's going to know the most about my stuff and maybe say the nicest things. Sometimes it's better to kind of go for more distance and gravitas in the external review selection process, rather than trying to just have a small network that you work with and pick from that. And I guess that's very vague. That's the first thing that occurs to me.
And I think if you do have a specialized field, build those relationships over time and stay on those relationships over time. I mean, I have colleagues and mentors who've been with me now for, gosh, a long, long time. And they're really helpful and they know you, right? And they also get to know you personally. And they know when you might be going through a difficult spell, they're checking up on you. They become not only your mentors, but your friends. And that's important as well.
Thank you, Britt. Devatosh, earlier you said something, you listed something about the 4 friends you needed. Could you repeat that really quickly for them?
My 4 friends is FRPC general statement, which are posted somewhere in the university website. Department or units criteria for tenure and promotion. FRPC general statements are very short. It's 4 or 5 pages. And departments criteria, some department has 30 pages long even. Some has 10, 15 pages. And especially departments criteria, some of those have started 30, 40 years ago and have many revisions, many wordsmithing happen. So that is why I mentioned that every word there has a meaning. Your advisory committee that your department, your academic unit appoints to assemble the dossier, collect the information that will form the dossier. For engineering, it is actually in general a 3-member committee, advisory committee. One person chairs the committee and is responsible for, let's say, one of the components, teaching service or research. And there are other 2 committee members. They are also doing one of the teaching service or research. So those advisory committee, those 3 members are going to help collect the information. The faculty member not going to collect information. Faculty member in general provide the CV, sample publications, and other information the advisory committee ask the candidate. Candidate will provide that to the faculty, to the advisory committee members, and advisory committee members will collect the information and prepare a report. Once that report gets prepared, then it will be assembling different components of the dossier to the ESPS. That is where I said that please try to take ownership of your dossier as much as your department allows. Now, this is the 3rd friend, and the 4th friend is your colleagues and the chairperson with whom you can talk if you have any question. You can find colleagues with whom you feel comfortable talking about something that you do not feel comfortable with talking with other people. So find a colleague in your department or in campus or in a committee that you have served. Join some university committee. I'm not asking that all our non-tenured faculty colleagues actually sign up for all the university very difficult committees. I'm not suggesting that. But if you serve in a committee, you know a colleague from another unit, ask that colleague, go for lunch, and maybe they will buy you a lunch or you will buy a lunch, build a friendship and talk with them. And so they will give you the advice that how you can go through the review process. If there are any wrinkle you see that you need to address, there are issues that you cannot talk even, let's say, with your department chair sometime. Find a friend like this who have gone through this process. And please understand that everyone have gone through some kind of challenging time, probably a small challenge or difficult challenge. So if you talk with someone, they will understand. So this is your 3rd friend, actually, your colleagues and chairperson.
Thank you, Devatosh. I appreciate that.
Can I also add a little bit on that? And I really think that it's worthwhile for us to not only identify the current CAP members, like CAP faculty members, I think it's also worthwhile to identify the previous members, the faculty members who have served on the committees. And especially, even though they're not from the same discipline, by talking to them, you get different perspectives in terms of how they review a certain case when they were on the committee. And honestly, they were probably a little bit easier to talk to because currently they're not serving on the committee.
Thank you. A couple follow-up questions to the issue of external reviewers. Someone asked if looking at the Carnegie classification listing is a place that might be useful to start looking when you're looking for potential reviewers.
I can share one of my experience. When I was appointed to our department's one of the research committee, the candidate provided 5 or 6 names, and I personally, in consultation with the advisory committee, went to R2 research classification university lists in Wikipedia. I literally did that. And then I selected those universities, searched their website, and tried to figure out the faculty who works in that area. And through this process, I collected approximately 10 names, and probably going to 30 or 40 universities. And then I shared those names with my advisory committee colleagues, passed those to the candidate, that these are the members we have selected. Candidate actually flagged out one person. He or she is one of my co-author. I said, oops. So as you can see how small the world is, that even randomly I selected R2 institutions, and I found selected one person who is actually a co-author of my colleague. So please, it is a good idea, as you have asked, that you can actually have similar institutions, colleagues, not necessarily that has to be, but it might be a good idea.
And for faculty who do have say in their units about who external reviewers might be, should they get the permission of the external reviewer before putting their names forward?
I personally would say that is a bit fishy potentially in terms of influence. And so sometimes things like this can't be avoided if you're at a conference and you're at a dinner table and these sorts of things come up, and I don't know. I mean, but I would say usually the more impartial, the better. And try to genuinely keep it impartial so that the letter writer can genuinely say, you know, I know this person by the person's work, but I don't know the person personally, or whatever like that. And I would say to the question of R1 versus R2, I think it's better to get, you know, really big names in your field if it's possible, people who are leaders in your field. But there is something to be said for people who understand institutions like Oakland being an R2 instead of an R1. Sometimes an external reviewer from an R1 might look at a scholarly profile of somebody coming from Oakland who has a higher teaching load than the person at the R1, and may not give as much of a fair shake to the kind of well-roundedness of a candidate from Oakland, because they don't understand the Oakland culture. So I don't think, initially when that was asked, I thought, I don't know if that's really necessary, but I think as thinking about it and listening to Devatosh's comment, sometimes it's not a bad idea to try to have somebody who at least is in a position to understand Oakland, a research university, but oftentimes with a bit higher teaching load than an R1, and no, you know, in my field, no doctoral students as well.
Thanks, Derek. Another question unrelated to that, but about documenting in regards to the pandemic, and do folks on FRPC or ones that sit on other review bodies have an idea of how that should look? So should the discussion about the pandemic, should that be a whole separate statement attached to the review dossier, or should that be included in the personal statement, or is there a way to, has that been thought through?
You know, given that we're probably on our way out of it, I would include it. I would include it in the personal statement in a subheading, right? The impact of COVID, you know, literally, because I think you can weave it through. And I think there are some things that have probably been positive, you know, in terms of having additional time, maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe to write, or I know some of my friends have made, and my colleagues have made advances in grants because they've had time to really sit and address. And then also the impact on teaching and what was done. I feel like that's the way I would do it if I had to do it. I'm not sure how you all feel, the other speakers feel, but that way it becomes part of it. And then, you know, as the years go by and then, you know, things get recouped, you could consider keeping it or not. But it helps you frame how it's impacted your own trajectory.
That certainly sounds sensible to me, as far as at least a notation of it or an indication in the personal statement, which then potentially could be removed if, you know, 2 years from now it turns out to not necessarily seem that relevant. So maybe like you're protesting too much or whatever, then you can kind of choose whether to keep it in there or not. But I think I would agree that that might be the good approach. But this also may be something that FRPC and the various CAP units could get some guidance from the AAUP after Kathy's joint committee is done, where they could, in addition to sort of thinking about all of the things I'm sure they're thinking about now, many of which she went through, if they could also be thinking about the kind of implementation stage for review bodies like FRPC, that would be very helpful, I would think, to kind of have us all be on the same sheet of music in that regard.
And I think that joint committee that Kathy's on, I think, you know, if they could maybe come up with some recommendations when they do come up with their sort of final statements to the departments and to faculty, that would be really helpful to have, you know, maybe a little bit more clear direction from coming out of that joint committee. I have another question. I'm trying to read it. Does the panel have thoughts about how grants are perceived in terms of value for tenure compared to seeking additional scholarly publications? Is it better to just publish, or are grants and journal articles considered to be equals?
The short answer is all depends on your field and on your unit's review statement. So that would be, I think, the best. It'd be very difficult to talk across all disciplines in the university and make any sense, I think, on that front, for me at least.
I was just going to say that's a hot potato because it really depends on what's happening in each unit. I would say that grants potentiate your ability to do your scholarship, but if you're writing grants and getting grants and not publishing on them, that eventually will come back to bite you, because when you're being reviewed, you're not showing how what you're doing from a grant angle is contributing to the science. So
another sort of opinion question here in terms of perception. Peer-reviewed chapters versus peer-reviewed journal articles. Is there a sense of one being more impactful than the other?
Again, depends on the field. And I think, so in my, in the humanities and social sciences, which I'm more familiar with, the big issue is making sure that you're aware of the difference between editor review and peer review. A lot of times there are things oftentimes with book chapters that the term peer review is sort of thrown around, but it really was the editor who had the proposal for the volume peer reviewed, and then the editor went over the individual chapters, but there may not have been that extra layer of the entire manuscript, including all of the chapters, then also being submitted for peer review. So I think in general, to answer the actual question, it would depend on the unit, right? My unit doesn't necessarily make a difference in history between an academic journal article that's peer reviewed and a genuinely peer reviewed book chapter in an edited volume. But I think we would make a differentiation between a peer-reviewed journal article and a book chapter that had been editor reviewed, but not necessarily peer reviewed. So I think, again, it's discipline specific, but just pay careful attention to the terminology there, and don't claim something necessarily if that's not the case. If that makes sense.
Derek, I think you said that really well. I mean, there's so many times when I've been invited to write a book chapter, and I'm writing a book chapter knowing that it's going to be edited, but is it really a peer review edit knowing that I've been invited to do it, right? So it really depends on whereas if it's an article and it's peer reviewed, I most likely, depending on how narrow my field is, have no idea who's doing that.
Right.
And I think this is where we come back to Debitosh's friends.
Yeah.
That if you're not really sure, talk to senior members in your department or your unit and say, well, is this the same? Because yeah, so.
I've asked all of my 8,000 questions. If anybody wants to send me other questions really quickly, or if anybody wants to speak up now and ask your own questions, you're welcome to do so.
I saw one question come up about it was a question about whether external reviewers are made aware of our R2 status. I don't know if that came through filtered, that just kind of popped up on my screen. And I think it depends on what information the solicitation letter contains when we ask for somebody to be willing to serve as an external reviewer. What we do in history is we send our review statement, our criteria, along with the review materials, so that the person understands here's exactly what's being expected at this university. I'm not going to use, I'm from Harvard. I'm not going to use our tenure requirement, tenure requirements for evaluating this person. So I think I'm actually not sure if that's codified and that every unit actually does that. Do you know, Devitosh or Liang, whether that information is always sent out, at least in your experience?
I think from my experience, it all depends on who sends out the letter. In our unit, I know that the chair is going to be the person who sends out the letter for the external review. If a junior faculty has concerns about the R2 status, I would highly encourage them to either talk to the chair or talk to the research committee to find out whether that information is included in the letter. Personally, I have never seen a letter, so I don't really know whether that is mentioned.
Okay, and I can add from engineering, we actually have a standard letter draft, and when an advisory committee actually send request for review to outside reviewers, external reviewers, we are required to use that letter template. In that letter template, there is no mention of our university's R1 on R2 status. However, it is my understanding the reviewer who is going to review, they will know where Oakland University is and where how its status is compared to the reviewer's institution. If I have to review, I certainly will probably check that, or will have understanding that from research perspective where this institution falls. So although it is not clearly from engineering mentioned, but my understanding is that a reviewer will have that understanding before they write the letter.
Somebody just asked whether or not what we're talking about the external reviewers being made aware of, right? And so the issue is whether external reviewers are made aware of the difference perhaps between their own R1 status, if that's where they're coming from, and Oakland's position in the kind of research pecking order. So that was what, and I guess the answer would be, it really varies, and I'm not sure that there's any kind of standard way of making sure the reviewers know that, although as Devitosh mentioned, we would hope that they would familiarize themselves, at least informally, with the university they're doing a review for.
Yep, and also another thing is that our university in Oakland University, or every university, different academic unit have a different research strength. So different area of strength. So simply comparing one R1 with another R1, it might not be 100% fair. So it might be more appropriate to think, what is the contribution of this candidate, which kind of articles the person has written, or what is the contribution? I think the R1, I'm not sure, R1, R2 will actually do true, put equity there, not sure.
You know, and in terms of, I just want to go back to something Liang said earlier on. And again, you know, perfect is the enemy of good. And I think she mentioned that, oh, there's so many things that once I submitted, I wish I would have done this way or that way. And again, you know, perfect is the enemy of good. And you obviously did a great job. So I think that, you know, those kinds of things in terms of learning are really important, because there's always going to be that one, oh, I should have mentioned this, or I forgot this committee, or, oh, remember when they sent that thank you letter because I did this work on that committee. There probably will be one or two things. You're just going for as close as you can get. We're busy folks. We're doing a lot of different things.
Karen, one thing you might just want to touch on is the fact that the dossier is the electronic dossier will be mandatory starting, I don't know what date you have that information.
Yeah, I just received communication from the current chair of FRPC that starting next year, all of the supplemental files will be electronic. We have, because we didn't get that information, we weren't able to send it out to y'all in the first communication. I know some units are already all electronic, so it shouldn't be a problem. Others were going electronic this year. So we do have some general guidelines for folks, and we can send them out to all the members, which is part of our plan. But basically, yes, the way that we are going to handle next year is it's going to be in eSpace, which was where it was this year. And that you will be, there is a structure to it. It's actually, I think once we get used to it, it's going to be pretty smooth. What I'm hearing anecdotally is that the people who did C1 and C2 reviews this year were sort of more comfortable with the system than those who were doing C4 reviews, because they had already done it a different way in some cases. So I think it's not terribly complicated. There is an instructional video at the top of the eSpace. So the way that it works is every department is assigned an eSpace for their review cases. And so every person then gets a separate space in that review category in eSpace. The upload process is not that complicated once you kind of figure out the instructions. So like all uploads, it's, you know, every system is slightly different. It's based on the structure of it is based on Moodle. So if you've been using Moodle, it should be pretty easy to make that segue to eSpace. And so I would encourage you to, you know, if you're going up for review next year, particularly even if you're going up, you know, if you're in a tenure situation or job security situation, so you won't actually be reviewed until, you know, in the winter term, but start looking at it and kind of looking at the videos, the instructional videos, if you haven't already seen them. This is how we do it. Talk to members of your units who have recently gone up for review, because they've been through the process and they can give you tips and that sort of thing. So I think in the long run, it's going to be an improvement over all of the paper that we've had, but it's not that bad, but you will be doing electronic for next year.
Fantastic question just was asked, that this is broader, honestly, than just even the reviews, because it's with more and more stuff being virtual. But with the transition to the electronic dossier, is there a plan for the university, and Britt, this one's for you, to purchase an Adobe PDF converter program that faculty university can use university-wide?
You know, I do not know. So, you know,
There should be. How about that?
I will say that my former institution deviated away from Adobe because there were other platforms that were much less expensive that offered additional features. So it was a decision. I didn't make that decision, but it was a decision to deviate away from that. I don't know.
Just from personal experience, having been in OU long enough, if we do have a process where we pick a PDF converter, if we can have really that just be an all faculty committee, because we've been known to pick some terrible technology. So I think that's one we should advocate for. I think we can have that conversation.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking is why don't we have that conversation on a broader when Joy's there and she can check it out.
I think it's a great idea. Thanks for that question.
Joy knows all. I'm brand new. So
We will add it to the list of things that we talk about.
absolutely.
We do talk regularly, so that's on the list. We'll keep asking questions
Great.
until we get it.
Or the best one, who knows, right?
Isn't what's you're saying, that perfection is the
Perfect is
enemy of good?
right? Perfect is always the enemy of good.
So we'll just go for good. Okay. Well, we seem to be running out of time, and I used to always run over, and I have been so badly scolded for that I'm making a deliberate effort not to run over. So I do want to thank all of our presenters for being here. You've done a wonderful job, and I really appreciate your time. And I want to thank all of the people who came here to get information. I am really delighted that you came, and I hope you learned things. I will point out, as I started by talking about the unhappiness that gets generated in the tenure process, but I would like to point out, if you got a job here, you're smart enough to get tenure.
Mhm.
That it's not just that we rubber stamp people, but you all have the skills. And there's a whole lot of people at the university that want you to be successful.
Mhm.
And so if you haven't found those people yet, keep looking, because they're there and they're probably not very far away.
Just a note that, just to remind everybody that I am recording this, and that once I convert it, I'll put it on the website. So if you have colleagues that weren't able to be here today, if you found this particularly helpful, you can let them know, pass that along.
Mhm.
And also, we'd like to see everybody on Thursday, or not Thursday, Wednesday at 5 p.m. because Rudy Fichtenbaum is going to be giving a talk, who's the former National AAUP chair and a professor emeritus at I can't speak, at Wright State University, and economist. So that will be Wednesday.
And it should be an extraordinarily useful talk in terms of understanding the sort of larger issues that have been affecting higher ed in the last 5 to 10 years. So I do strongly encourage you all to come. Also, we have a workshop on explaining the bargaining process in Michigan. And that's going to be on April the 1st. And so we also, if you are at all curious about how bargaining works, we invite you to come to that as well. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a lovely day. Enjoy some of the sunshine that we have outside, and have a good rest of your semester. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Bye.
Thanks, Karen. Great job. I'm stopping the recording now.
Okay, good.